Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us. And those of us that are live, we would love to hear from you. So pop in a hello in the chat. And also, if you have any questions for us or comments, we'd love to hear that as well. So keep the chat going. So thrilled to be here today. So welcome to episode 13 of Exploring Intersections, which is a dedicated live stream space for unpacking intersections as we co-create a future work that works for everyone. So every episode, we delve into a particular intersection, and we have a special guest that has a lot of lived experience at that intersection. And we just basically dig deeper into that intersection and try to unpack it a little bit. We think that intersections are really the home of diverse perspectives. And they really offer us this an opportunity to develop empathy and create inclusion and belonging. So that's why we love having these conversations. So today's special guest is the lovely Akua Nyame-Mensah, who's joining us from Ghana at this point, which is 1 o'clock your time. Yeah, Akua? Yeah. Welcome. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Really, really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So Akua is an executive and leadership coach and a recognized facilitator and speaker. And I know, Akua, you do the I Am Remarkable workshops. Yeah. So, and the host of the Open Door Conversations podcast. And Akua, congratulations on the 50th episode of the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been exciting to follow your work and on LinkedIn and otherwise. I know that you work with entrepreneurial-minded leaders and really help them in figuring out where they should focus their time and energy, so that they go from reactive to proactive. And I know that you've also been a startup executive yourself, and you've done a lot of work in that space, particularly in the African continent. And like I said, Akua is currently based in Ghana, but she has lived and worked in the US and many, many countries in the African region and has traveled to over 30 countries around the world. What a phenomenal repertoire of work, Akua. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, I'm really just excited to have this conversation with you. I feel like every time we have a chance to connect, I learn so much as well. So just thank you.
Absolutely. And how we met is a personal story. So we actually only met through LinkedIn, really, and through Coffee Chat, which is the digital coaching platform based in Africa and with services around the world. And we also have a common friend, Tiffany Castano. Shout out to you, Tiffany. I know we're going to catch the recording. So Tiffany and I, we had met a couple of years ago, and that's how we all got connected. So really, really excited to have this conversation today. And today's intersection is about culture, language, and gender, and particularly in the context of leadership. So this is a topic that I've had conversations with a couple of guests in the past as well. And it was more in the context of experience as an immigrant in the US. One of my guests also talked about accent bias, and in this case, it worked in their favor because they're originally from the UK. So how all of these aspects really sort of create the intersectional identity, which is the true reality, right? So today, we are going to look at how this intersection of culture, language, and gender really plays out in the context of leadership. Leadership. I like I'd said in my message about this chat, also is that it's such an overused term, particularly these days. But today, what we want to look at is how well do we really understand it, and what about the intersectional aspects of leadership, culture, gender, language being just one set of these intersectional aspects, and what does impactful leadership really look like at this intersection? So, having said all that, Akua, I would love to start off this conversation by asking you, what does this intersection mean to you as an individual?
Yeah, I was so excited when you actually reached out to have this conversation, and we were sort of talking a little bit about, okay, which of these elements do we want to focus on? And I think that this intersection of culture, language, and gender is so interesting, right? Because you could also say that language and gender is culture, right? Or that is cultural, right? So depending on what culture you're in, like language could be looked at differently. And you can also break that down into, accent and the actual specific language you speak. And then with gender, right? Some cultures where it may be more open to recognizing that, gender isn't binary, or you might be in a culture where they only choose to see it as, either or. So from my perspective, this has been incredibly important to my own journey, my own leadership journey, my journey in my personal life, because I come from a very diverse background. I have one parent who's from the US. I have another parent from Ghana, and just already there, right? Those are two very distinct cultures, even though both my parents are Black, that have very different languages, very different accents, and very different ideas about or around what success looks like. So as I think about this intersection in relation to my leadership journey, I think a key part has been recognizing that we each have our own version of reality, right? That is shaped by the culture that we grew up in, right? The languages that we speak, the way we speak those languages, right? And how we also present ourselves, right? So gender can also be around people's perception of you as well. And so throughout my leadership journey, I think it's been very interesting to redefine what a leader looks like to myself, and also challenge other people's perceptions around what a leader should look like, should sound like, how they should dress, how they should do their hair in the countries that I've decided to live in. So though I live in a country, right, or even my first real leadership job was in a country where, we were all Black, right? But I wasn't necessarily the right Black, right? So that bit of colorism, which I always find really fascinating, right?
Yep.
I had the right name, but when I opened my mouth to speak, I didn't speak the right language, right? My accent wasn't right. My intonation wasn't right. And literally having people tell me that, hey, you shouldn't sound like that. You need to sound differently if you want to be successful within this box or this environment, right? And really just getting more comfortable with the fact that I could still be successful, right? Being myself and showing up as myself, but also recognizing that there are times when you do need to honor the environments that you're in, right? And for that, I'm thinking mostly about maybe how I dress primarily more than anything else. But in terms of changing my accent, that's personally not something I've ever really been open to doing, right? In some places, you might call that code switching. Even, in a place where, all of us look somewhat the same, there is still a lot of code switching. So that could be more of the actual words that you use, right? Intonation's a really big one, right? I speak very quickly and I don't necessarily, there's not much of a variance in the way in which I emphasize the words. And so I think as a leader, recognizing these elements can make it so much easier for you to be able to support others, to influence others, and of course, bring others along. But you have to take the time to cultivate your own self-awareness around it and recognize that that can also evolve, right? Your accent can evolve depending on who you're around, right? The words you use can evolve depending on who you're around. And also your definition of what's right and wrong. And you can say for the most part, that's kind of what culture is about. It's about defining, what's right, what's wrong, what success looks like. That can also evolve or even shift depending on who you're around and what culture you're in as well.
Absolutely. That was so rich, and thank you for sharing your personal story as well around your own experience. Yeah, and so much of what you shared resonated with me. Akua, originally from India, and I'm originally from the South, but I grew up in the North, and the cultures are so different, and the languages obviously they're all different, including the script and grammar and everything. And I was kind of chuckling to myself when you said I had the right name, but
I did. When I'm in Ghana, I have the right name. It's, they're like, that is, that's the name. But, I've had people be like, we're disappointed in how you sound. And I'm just like, oh, wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally understand that. And I haven't had that in the face of a response, but I would, people are like genuinely shocked because my name is very typical South Indian.
Okay.
But the first language I learned was Hindi, which is the official language of the country, and also predominantly spoken in the northern parts of the country because that's where I grew up because of my dad's job. But and I did this whole north south quite a few times in my life, and so it's like I look different. So so I have had the same experience where either my name doesn't match what I look like, or definitely doesn't match when I open my mouth. And so having lived in the US for the last 14 years, that's been a totally different experience as well, because now I'm generalized as South Asian and often mistaken for a Latina or Middle Eastern. So it really depends, like you said, it depends on who I'm with and where I am. So much of that resonates with me. And I also, for those watching or who will catch the replay, I'll plug in the conversations that I had with Kwan Segal and Nigel Wilson around the same intersection and their experiences. And Akua, if you get some time to catch that, you'll see the common threads around that experience. Something you talked about, understanding who you are and figuring out the self-awareness piece that you talked about. I want to dig into that a little bit more. One thing I would like to walk away from this conversation is an understanding of what an individual's leadership stance can look like, right? So can you talk a little bit more about how the self-awareness can lead to each of us defining what leadership looks like for ourselves? Like, what's been your process for that?
I think that's a really great question. And it's where I really like to start, because for so many of the people that I support, what they're typically saying is, or the story they're telling themselves is, I don't have time, right? Because I talk a lot about that unit of time, and that unit of time, related to productivity and then ultimately success. I don't have time to treat people as individuals, right? I'm just going to treat everyone just like me. So whether or not you're explicitly saying that, unconsciously, that could be one way that you're showing up as a leader. And that's really going to limit your ability to engage, right? And set expectations for those who are following you, those who are supporting you, right? Those who are helping you in your business, right? Or within your department. So that cultivating awareness piece, I think, it's just so key. But once again, as I mentioned before, right, so many leaders either just assume that people are like them, right? And so they would just approach people just like them, right? They assume that people's definition of success is like them. They assume that people will communicate like them, make decisions like them. And that's why, to really be able to step up into a leadership position, no matter what level you're in, it's really important that you start to really reflect on those stories that you're telling yourself. And we can actually, talk, I like to use the word stories because I feel like it doesn't lead to a lot of resistance, but ultimately it's bias. That's really what it is. The stories you tell yourself are really the biases that you have. And that's going to be determined by your culture, how you grew up, how you were socialized, right? How you define what good language or successful language is, right? And ultimately, it's also going to impact what your expectations are based on superficial traits that could lead to whatever type of gender, once again, that you are open to, whether it's binary or a spectrum, right? So really just recognizing that those are some of the elements that can either hinder or support your ability to bring people along and ultimately, right, have a positive impact on your bottom line. So as we start to think about these elements, the stories we tell ourselves and the biases, it becomes very important that you get curious to what your expectations are, right? Because that's what's happening. When someone sees you and you sound the way you do, or you say you grew up in this place, or you speak a certain language, what you're doing is sort of shocking them. They had a certain expectation in their head about what you should sound like, where you should have gone to school, what you do, the way you should have dressed. And that gets in their way, right, of being able to actually leverage you effectively. That gets in their way of being able to negotiate. That gets in their way of creating a win-win opportunity. And that's why you need to, if you're a leader, and once again, at any level, get curious about some of these assumptions, these stories you tell yourself based on people engaging with you, because ultimately you're not creating the best environment for anyone, right? you, right, are missing out on something potentially, right? And, you're not really able to engage to be able to get anywhere. And so if that happens time after time, right, that's not going to lead to any positive benefits. Like there's no net benefit from that. And so, a more concrete example might be in the workplace. If you don't recognize that you have a story you tell yourself that a woman is supposed to speak in a certain way, you might realize that the behaviors you have or what shows up for you is if you're in a meeting and a woman, maybe, raises their hand and has a different opinion than you, right? And in this case, of course, I'm thinking maybe stereotypically man, and a woman has a different opinion than you, even if she expresses that opinion in a very constructive manner, you might be taken back by it because where you grew up, what you've been told your entire life and what you continue to tell yourself is that, no one that I perceive as a woman can have a different opinion to me, right? And if they do, right, especially in a public space, I will respond in a certain way, right? So that's kind of how it could potentially come across, and why it's so important to get curious and cultivate that self-awareness. One thing I always love to share with my clients when we think about this, it's not an exact science because a lot of us as humans is actually unconscious, right? Like a lot of our decision making just happens automatically. We don't really recognize it until it's too late. And that's why it's important to take a second, maybe before acting on some of these assumptions and stories we tell ourselves. But I sometimes love to play this game with myself, even where I engage with someone or read something or see a picture. And I'm like, oh, what's the first thought that comes into my head?
Yep.
Is that a helpful thought or is there another way or more constructive way to engage with it? And that is also a good way of helping to help you think about what's coming across. There's some really interesting workbooks around this that I've seen, even around sort of trying to dismantle racism and some of those elements. What's the first thought that comes to mind when you hear a British accent, right? Is it, oh, that person is incredibly intelligent, even without listening to the words, just hearing that accent makes you jump to that conclusion. Then maybe there's some things that you have to work on.
Yes. Gosh, so many things that are coming to mind right now when you shared that. One is around the bias piece that you talked about. Verna Myers, the chief of strategy at Netflix, one of the things she talks about is biases are nothing but stories that we make up about people even before we've met them, right? And she calls that out in her TED Talk. And you're so right. And I also love how you called out that because of our conditioning, we're really in a state of shock when we see something different, when the pieces don't fall together in the way we are told that they should. There's a state of shock. That made me think about how we still go back to our flight or fight or freeze mode, right? Thank you so much for calling that out, because it's really, there's so much to unpack from a neuroscience of the brain standpoint, right? Everything that we say or do has some explanation, and just like you said, take a second. And I love what you said about think about what's the first thought, and is that a helpful thought? Really question all your thoughts. Really, that was fantastic. The last thing about the accent that you said about the British accent. So one of my former guests on this, Nigel Wilson, he's originally from the UK, and he's biracial, and he's been in the US for many years now. So his experience is that. So his experience, because of his accent, his experience is probably he's higher on the pecking order, if you will, just because of his accent. And
I mean, it's a true thing. I know that I get access to opportunities just because of the way I sound. And I also know that I literally piss off some people because of the way I sound. It doesn't matter what I say. I have some conversations with people. They're like, you sound like a used car salesman. And I'm like, I am not even selling right now. I am not talking about anything related to money and sales, but that's fine, right? If that's how you respond, that's fine. Yeah. And the accent piece, I find actually just so interesting. And it used to be incredibly triggering for me. Actually, some of my friends actually might say it's still triggering, simply because I grew up in a very multicultural environment where everyone had different accents, and it was really celebrated actually to sound somewhat different. And so for me, I just have always been able to understand people who had different accents trying to, to speak English. But for others, once again, they're just so used to hearing certain types of accents, their brain literally shuts down. I find it incredible. I actually, once again, love to do experiments related to this, because when people see my name, right, they see me, they have an expectation I'm going to sound a certain way. So when I open my mouth, they're not even trying to comprehend, right? It's just like, oh, whoa, like, this is not right. Whatever, they're just so focused on what's not right, as opposed to trying to actually listen to what I have to say. But I think it's fascinating, right? So people even listening, there's some research around people listening to people who don't necessarily have that standard American or British accent speaking in English. And people will automatically assume that they're not as intelligent because they have an accent. And that, once again, it just shocks me, because I grew up in such multicultural environments that I focus on the words people are saying as opposed to the accent. So it's a very interesting thing. And if you're a leader, you need to watch out, once again, if that's something that happens in the meetings, right? Or as you have conversations with potential clients or potential employees, are you actually listening to what they're saying? Or are you so focused on some of those superficial traits that the message is getting lost, right? And once again, that's not helpful for anyone.
So well pointed out. Accent bias is a real thing. And those of us that speak English as an additional language, we know that. Then that's our lived experience, and I'm one of them. And that's also one of the reasons I focus on people in my work as a personal agility and self-leadership coach. I really focus on the mid-career segment and people who speak English as an additional language. And I want to share something here with you, Akua. My own shift in how I think about it. So I'm a trained English as a second language teacher. And I worked only with adult learners. I did that when I was in India. Yeah. And so it's so interesting that for the time that I did that, and even for the longest time, I would always use those terms like non-native speakers of English. And one of the reasons I could not have that career in the US is because I'm not a native speaker of the language.
Oh, okay.
So and I don't have those certifications that are required in the space. I was trained on the job, and I did that for 5-6 years in India. And I would use the same terms as non-native speakers of English, and I would refer to myself as one of that, right? Even the certifications, it's teaching English to speakers of other languages is one of the TESOL is one of the certifications. And then just about 5-6 months ago, I would say, I really started paying close attention to these terms. And I started seeing how much of othering exists in this, right? Just by saying non-native speakers of English, to me, that's a very ethnocentric view of the world. And I actually changed the language for my own practice at North Star. I used to say non-native speakers of English. Then I moved to saying people who speak English as their second, third, or fourth language. And my latest iteration is to say people who speak English as an additional language. And that's it.
I love that.
Right? But what you said about the self-awareness piece, and also how people view you based on how you sound. And English being generally associated with a level of intelligence.
I don't understand why.
Yeah.
It makes no sense to me.
Yes, but it is, right? And
it is, unfortunately.
It is. And I have lived through that bias as an ESL teacher in India, because in India, your English speaking skills is considered a passport to a better life, better opportunities. So there's so much focus on that. And the BPO revolution just changed that. The business process outsourcing units, offices that are set up in India, the call centers, they just changed that because everybody was about accent training.
Yes, I watched a very interesting documentary about that. Yeah.
So all those thoughts are coming back to me now. This is such an interesting conversation.
I think that's so amazing that you've taken the time to go on this journey of being open to even talking about that skill and how you've changed the name, and that you haven't felt the need to be stuck with what is existing. Because that's a huge thing. Because people are like, well, we've always called it that way. And I'll be like, so what? Why can't we change it? And I love, and even as you said, those different words, they do have a different feeling and a different connotation, right? English for non-native English speakers versus English as an additional language.
Yeah.
It does have a very different feeling, and I think a very different impact. And I think it's the additional language piece that is, I mean, technically they're all true, but that last one, I think that's so much more empowering. And I have, I only, to be honest, I really only speak English. I did take French for the majority of my life, and I grew up in primarily Francophone countries. But let's just say languages and I, even English, sometimes we don't always get along, but I am just always so just impressed by individuals, who speak more than one language. Last week I actually did a hashtag I'm Remarkable session with a team based in Spain. And there was one woman who was actually originally Italian, who learned Spanish to move to Spain, and then is speaking English on this call. And I'm just like, that is remarkable. I'm conducting this entire thing in English. And for all of them, English is their second or third or fourth language.
Yeah.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible.
Right. Yes. And it has actually taken me my move to the US to really have a completely different perspective on that. Because I started noticing here how people differentiate among themselves based on this, the regional accents. And here I'm sitting thinking, but gosh, it's just the same language. Because in India, if you cross state lines, you can't make sense of the signs if they're in the local language, because it's completely different, right? So for me, language diversity is really, the context is the scale is completely different. And so I struggled with that a lot when I first moved to the States. And I live in Virginia, which is kind of, depending on who you ask, it can be south or north.
Kind of south. Yeah, it's like, yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway, so there's so much there to that. And one other thing that came up for me was when you said English is an additional language, that sounds empowering. I just realized how true that is, because when you say non-native speakers of English, you're really focusing on what they're not.
Exactly. Exclusion almost, right?
Exactly. Isn't it? But when I say additional, which means they do something else and they speak English on top of that. And to me, that also, I just realized it myself as you said that, because then it makes English is just another language. It is not the language.
It's not. And it is not.
Yeah. So the next thing I wanted to ask you is what, given this intersection that we've been talking about, for those of us like you and me who really live at this intersection, what are some ways, and for those who realize that this is where they are, right? All of us have, this intersection is true for, I would say, all of us.
Yeah.
So how can we continue to create impact and create value despite all the challenges of this intersection?
I think one part might be just to acknowledge that it can be challenging, right? I think a part of it is acknowledging that this is something that's somewhat complex. There's no right answer. Because once you acknowledge that, I do think it becomes a lot easier to engage and then recognize that, hey, I can evolve my perspective on this, or something might need to shift in order to get everyone across the finish line. So I do think a big part about tackling some of these challenges around, this intersection and recognizing that everyone's experience is a little different is to acknowledge that, hey, we might disagree on some elements, but if we're thinking about it from the context of a company, it's important that we build some sort of common language to have conversations around this. I'm looking down because I actually do have some notes. Funny enough, I think that that are relevant to this question, but a huge part, right? So that there's that community part of everyone recognizing, hey, this is something that we need to acknowledge, and we need to acknowledge that everyone might be on different journeys and on different pages in relation to this. So that's what we can do as a community or as an environment. And I think that will lead to some level of psychological safety for each individual then to reflect on how they define, and I literally put this here, or what they consider normal. Because what I consider normal is different from somebody else's definition of normal, right? Because we all do have different realities. And I also put down, right, as an individual, or the company needs to give individuals the opportunity to consider this, is how do they define normal? How do they think about their expectations, especially in relation to their colleagues or to their subordinates? And also, what are they willing to accept? because that's going to look very different for everyone. And that's going to be somewhat driven, right, by someone's culture, what someone thinks is correct within, once again, that gender, that they've perceived for themselves or they've defined for themselves, and that language, right, or accent, or the elements of that also that they've defined for themselves as well. So I think that there is a cultural or environmental sort of element that needs to be acknowledged, and that can be done, of course, within a company, if we're thinking about it from that perspective, and then an individual opportunity. And I think that this can be modeled by leaders, right? So leaders need to take the lead on this, because as human beings, a lot of our thoughts around how to show up as a leader, right, what success looks like, what's good and what's bad, is based on what we see others doing and what we think is correct or successful for what they're doing. So if you have a leader that's modeling that, hey, like, there's no right answer, and these are what I was expecting because of this experience I've had, it becomes a lot easier of a conversation, and people are a lot more likely to engage in it and start to redefine what success looks like for that environment. Once again, right, if we're thinking about it from the perspective of a company.
Mm-hmm. That's a great call out, to take the time to, first of all, define what normal looks like. And then that gives us a baseline for us to look at, okay, but then there are all these other things, and this is what the spectrum is. Acknowledging what the baseline is to ourselves will give us the opportunity to then open our hearts and minds to the entire spectrum. Really love that. You work with a lot of founders. You are very active in the startup ecosystem. What are some things, like the top one or two things that you partner with your clients on, who are founders and new leaders?
Yeah, so part of it is this, right? So I don't necessarily use this language, and that's why language is so important, because it can create resistance. So I don't necessarily talk about it from the perspective of bias, but I do talk about it from the perspective of, it's really important that you get very clear on your strengths and your weaknesses, the stories you tell yourself, the assumptions that you jump to. One of the first things I love doing with my clients is helping them build what I describe as standard operating procedures. There are other sort of variations of this where it's like your operation manual, just helping them see that just by taking the time to reflect on how they might be showing up and what their expectations are, that just makes it so much easier for them to engage with others. And what that also will identify is how they treat themselves as well. Because what it will lead them to sometimes recognize is that, hey, the expectations they set for themselves is super high. And then they have those same expectations for others who have a very different cultural upbringing, very different educational background, very different ways of growing up than them. So it really just helps to make it easier for them to engage with others and also empathize as well, because they recognize, like, oh, hey, wait, this is my way of operating, and it's going to be different from everyone else. So that's the first thing I do with all of the clients I work with one-on-one, helping them get very clear on how they show up. And then thinking about, if someone was the opposite of me, how could I help to bridge that gap?
You know what this brings up for me is, one of the things you had said earlier in the conversation was how people can say that, oh, I don't have the time for this. How do you help your clients tackle that?
Once again, that's where language comes in, right? So with some clients, it might be around them finally recognizing that things aren't going their way. So unfortunately, and I'm sure you know this as a coach as well, that sometimes it does take people hitting a brick wall. So sometimes it does take an external, in the case of founders, an external investor who just puts their foot down and is like, dude, your retention is terrible. You need to do something different, right? Or it takes like an important member of their team leaving, right? For them to recognize, like, hey, there might be something different going on here. For other clients, it might be their family members who are really upset at them because they have no more time for them. And so something needs to change. So typically it is a little bit more of an external push that a lot of my clients need to seek out my support. But typically by the time they've reached out to me, they've kind of gone through this process where they recognize, like, hey, something needs to shift and change. And for a lot of them, because they use that unit of time as a measure of success, right, a measure of productivity, it's around shifting their perspective around that to recognize that, hey, taking a few minutes to reflect every single day can completely shift how my day goes and how I engage with others. I think I recently listened to was a podcast or read some research around how just taking, was it like 1 or 2 minutes to plan every day can save you 10 minutes. So just recognizing those little things can have a massive impact, and reflecting on how am I showing up and what do I need to do to support others who are supporting me can go such a long way and help you make better use of your team ultimately, right? Because the key question I always love to ask, and even I do this for myself now, even though I don't have that stereotypical team, I'm typically working with other service providers, right? My podcast manager or my VA, is asking myself, like, what do they need from me in order to be successful? Because that's typically the key, right? So what is it I need to give them so they can be set up for success? And that's the question that most, especially early stage founders, need to be asking themselves every single day.
That was such a powerful question. What do others need from me for them to be successful? And that just shifts everything. And you are no longer, the spotlight is not on you. It's on people you serve or support. That's fantastic. As we begin to wrap up this conversation, Akua, I wanted to ask you, what are your parting thoughts for new and rising leaders around this intersection?
The first thing that comes to mind is that this can actually be very scary. To start to realize that some of the things that you've been told your entire life and some of the things that you've held as truths for your entire life actually are just stories, right? Are just beliefs. And that there are a lot of things that we've been told as kids that may have been helpful at some point in time, but where we are now may no longer really serve us. So that's the first thing, just recognizing that it can be very, very scary to get to this point where you say to yourself, like, oh, my entire life I've been told having my natural hair, and I'm just thinking specifically about what I've heard some people tell me, but like having my natural hair and, and having it out in a professional setting, makes me look like I am not capable or is unprofessional. And so when you see someone who's comfortable with their natural hair in a professional setting, you might get real angry and mad, right? You might be like, whoa, this is something I've been told my entire life. Like this, I had to look like this. I had to dress like this. I had to code switch. I had to make my accent this way. And that wasn't necessarily the truth, right? Or maybe it kind of worked, a bit, but it actually took up a lot of energy. So I think that I want to leave everyone with just that perspective, that it can be really scary to start to challenge some of your beliefs, some of your assumptions, some of the things that you've been told time and time again by people who probably do love you and want the best for you. But you can evolve. Your beliefs, your stories that you tell yourself can shift, and it might lead to much bigger and better things for you and those that you love as well.
That was so powerful. Thank you. Thank you, Akua. It really calls for such a lot of reflection and also courage to identify and then accept, and then to say, okay, I can shift this and take a different perspective on that. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today and sharing your insights, your personal experience at the intersection of culture, gender, and language, particularly in the context of leadership. What's the best way for folks to connect with you or get in touch with you, Akua?
Yeah, just first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for sharing more of your story as well. I think it's always amazing to hear more about, hear more about you and also your thoughts in relation to this topic. But I would say LinkedIn is probably the best way for people to reach out. So I see my name is there. So if you just search my name, that, my profile will pop up. You're also welcome to just search my name in Google. I'm sure my website and some of the other things that I've done will also pop up there as well.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And before I wrap up this conversation for today, I do want to put a plug in for Building My Runway, which is North Star Solutions and Services mentorship program offering. So it is particularly, and it's so in line with today's conversation because it's targeted at mid-career women in technology. So if you're a woman professional in the technology space with about 8 to 12 years of experience, and if you speak English as an additional language,
yes, I love it.
Yeah, and so this actually, thinking while I was creating the messaging for the program is when this whole thing occurred to me, and so you'll see more of that in the coming weeks on that story. But yeah, so this is a mentorship program. This is the second year we're doing this. It's a small cohort of 11 mentees only. So you have the opportunity for 3 months of one-on-one mentorship. And then there's also 10 plus hours of group coaching and learning along with the cohort. So the program itself launches in August, which is the 3rd anniversary month for North Star Solutions and Services. So very excited about that. So we share some birthdays, Akua.
I'm excited. Yes,
Yeah.
so excited.
So I'm putting in the link for that. So if you're a woman professional in technology, a mid-career professional, and you speak English in addition to other languages, then this is a program that's specially designed for you. It's virtual, it's global, and very, very small cohort. So we have extended the application timeline till the 16th of July. So there's another week for you to consider and apply, and look forward to hearing from you. So once again, thank you everyone for being here today. And thank you so much, Akua.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. Be well.